Hey, this is Chris with Phoenix Gaming. Today we're going to talk about Warlords of Erehwon. This is from Warlord Games, actually. This is my review, kind of my first look and reactions. Before we dig in, I want to share some announcements with you. First of all, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. Thanks. Also, the Firefight series is going to continue. Specialist units from the Veermen are coming up next week. We should see that video. Like I said, hitting early next week, maybe late. We'll see how the week goes and how much I can get written on it. And then we're going to start covering a bit more Halo Flashpoint as more stuff is released. I got my hands on the Elites box, or at least the rules and the models. And so I'm curious to get them on the table. So we'll do a review of them in the next couple of weeks as well. And we're going to start running news segments. I already mentioned that, but I wanted to make sure I let everybody know again. And as always, if you want to support me, support the channel, there are links in the description that'll get you to, our merch store, stuff like that. So thanks a lot. And last but not least, Warlords of Erehwon is a lot of fun. It does use 10-sided dice. I didn't have any lying around in excess, so I had to order some, and there's some affiliate links if you need to order some as well in order to enjoy this game. Big, huge shout out to Military Gaming Command. They are a nonprofit organization that supports veterans. I will continue to shout them out every video. I apologize if you don't like that, but they do something that's very important to me and very important to a community that I belong to, so I'm going to continue to support them in any way that I can. First of all, we're going to look at an overview of how this is going to go. What are we looking at when we review tabletop and board games? We're going to rate everything on a 1 to 5 scale. 1 is basically like it's dumpster juice at the bottom of the dumpster. 5 is perfection, pinnacle of gaming. And, there's wiggle room in there for interpretation. But first thing we're going to rate it on is ease, simplicity. Not only is it easy to play, but also is it just easy to get into? Does the game do a good job of walking you through rules? Is the rule book structured in a logical manner? Is there a high bar of entry? Games like Warhammer or Old World, and I'm not putting them down at all, but those would have a lower ease rating than games like Halo Flashpoint because there's no model building for Halo Flashpoint. You can go from box to table in maybe 10 minutes. Whereas games like Warhammer 40,000 or Old World, they're going to take a lot more time investment. They're going to take a lot more upfront to get on the table. So they'll have a lower ease rating. Second thing we're going to rank it on is interactivity. Is the game interactive? And is it interactive in a meaningful way? There are mechanics out there that are interactive, but they're not really interactive in a meaningful way. And we're not going to dive into that. But just know, that's what we're looking at. There are a lot of mechanics that override another player's ability to interact or play. Does play kind of flow smoothly between players, etc.? And then and then we're going to talk about investment. Is the game hard to learn? Does it become fun as you learn it? Not just money, but total investment. And then fit and finish. Are the models nice? Is terrain nice? Is the rule book well structured and printed? Is it gorgeous? Stuff like that. Before we dig in, what is Warlords of Erehwon? It is a fantasy-based tabletop strategy game from Warlord Games. There's going to be a link to their PDF in the description. If you like the review and you think it looks interesting, check the game out. Again, not to spoil anything, but I've had a lot of fun with it. It's worth it. It's the same people that publish Bolt Action. It's written by Rick Priestley, and for the old heads that have been in the hobby for a while, you're going to recognize that name. It does implement a lot of familiar mechanics that we've seen across multiple games. It's got order dice, which are used in Bolt Action. It utilizes USRs, Universal Special Rules, which is going to feel familiar to anybody who's played Old World or Firefight or Kings of War. And then obviously we have pin tokens, again, from games like Bolt Action. It does use D10s, so if you don't have a lot of D10s laying around and this is a game you're interested in, it's worth the $10 investment to just get a big bag of D10s, because that's all you'll ever need for the game. And there's plenty of other 10 die based games. So let's talk about ease. If you aren't familiar with order dice, they can be a little clunky at first. And that's because each die has 6 sides, and each side corresponds to an order. And some of the orders kind of feel repetitive, even though we're not. So, for example, you have a fire order and then you have an advance order. The advance order lets you move and shoot, but the fire order only lets you shoot. But if you take a fire order, you get to add one to your hit rolls when you shoot, unless you have a specific rule that says you can't. So that's what I mean by, like, they can feel a little clunky when you first start using them. But once you play a few games, it starts flowing and becoming more smooth. I've played bolt action a couple of times in my past, so I had at least a rudimentary understanding for how the game was going to work before I dove into it. If you've never used it, like I said, you're only used to like GW games or even Mantic games, the order dice are going to feel kind of weird at first. Implementing USRs means both players just need a single rulebook to play. Again, just like with Old World, and maybe that's not a good example because they have all their individual army books. But even just looking at Old World, where everybody's rules are basically in the core rulebook, outside of like your unit and army structure and a few other things, similar concept. So an orc might have two different special rules, but those special rules are in the core rulebook. And then a Night Warrior might have two special rules that are different from the Orcs, but they're still in the core rulebook. So everybody has the same access to the same pool of rules. Just how they're kind of distributed throughout their army is what gives it its flavor. Thankfully, there is list building in Battle Scribe. It looks fairly up to date. It hasn't been updated in a few years. But I don't know that the game's been updated in a few years. It has been updated, but I don't know when, and I don't know that armies were updated. It may have just been core mechanics, but I'll kind of dig into that later. There are certain mechanics besides the order dice that feel a little clunky also. Pinning and tracking pins, holding run orders. Again, a lot of it isn't that it's hard. It's just when you first start playing it, it's like, it feels like a lot to kind of manage or remember. And there are a lot of different modifiers for hit rolls, especially shooting. And this isn't bad, it's not good, it's just the way the game works. And it's one more thing to track. I do dig into this again a little bit later because there's a minor gripe I have with regard to this, if you're going to have this many modifiers, but we'll cover that in a bit. And then the game is designed to be generic enough to be played with almost any fantasy miniature. And that's both a good and a bad thing. So some of the things that I've told you are positives. Some of them are kind of negatives. And that's basically how I see this. It's a very average ease factor. I wouldn't give it a 3, but I wouldn't give it a 4. So we're gonna meet right in the middle at that 3.5 out of 5. The game itself isn't difficult, but if you're not used to the mechanics that are in the game, it can take you a little bit longer to kind of adjust to them coming from, like I said, say like a GW or a Mantic game. Coming from GW to a Mantic game was a smooth transition for me. Even though their games tend to be structured differently, there's enough similarities. Like going to Firefight, I was like, oh, well, this doesn't play like 40K, but it does play like Necromunda or Kill Team, just on a bigger scale, so I could make that transition. There's not really a lot of good parallels to go from any of the I guess, bigger games, unless you just play bolt action. So that's what I mean, is there's not a lot of crossover where you can go, oh, well, this works like this here. I understand how it works now. So that's what I mean. So again, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Pretty solid. Not super difficult to get into. It just takes a few games to kind of work out some of the kinks. Interactivity. Order dice were my first introduction to alternating activations on a large scale. The first game I played that was like mass battles that didn't just go with an I go, you go structure was Bolt Action. And I enjoyed it. It was a fine game. There's things about Bolt Action I could take or leave. I don't hate it. I don't love it. I'm more interested in Conflict 47, and a lot of that is just a personal thing. When I play these games, I want some sort of like fantasy or science fiction element. So when they don't have it, my brain, I just like, I don't really want to play it, right? Like, I either want like big stompy robots and some infantry and some tanks, or some wizards, or maybe some both. But when it's just like, here's some dudes and here's some more dudes, why don't you dudes just dude it up? I just kind of like check out mentally, because I'm just like, yeah, this is all just the same. And again, I'm not putting down bolt action. I'm just giving you my perspective on what I want from a tabletop game. But that being said, order dice were my first introduction to alternating activations, and before then, my only games that I had played with alternating activations were the newer version of Necromunda, the newer Kill Team, and outside of that, everything else I had played at that point had GW's I Go, You Go structure. I had even played Kings of War at one point, which is still structured with an I Go, You Go system. I do find that the order dice are pretty interactive, and I like the kind of randomness to it. A lot of times, they are fairly balanced, provided that the players have relatively equal numbers of dice. There are occasionally turns in which one player spends a lot of time sitting and waiting, but those are pretty few and far between, and generally speaking, I found that the order dice flow pretty well. And if you don't know what order dice are, is you count up how many units you have in your army. This is the most basic way to describe it. There's some nuance here, but the most basic way to describe it is you count up how many units you have in your army. Each unit generates one order die. You get that many dice, you put them in a bag. Make sure that they're a specific color. Like all your dice should be green. Then your opponent does the same thing. They count up all their dice based off of how many units they have. And then they collect them up and they put them in the same bag. And their dice should be a different color than yours so that you know whose dice are whose. So if yours are green and mine are blue and we both have 10, there should be 10 green and 10 blue dice in the bag for a total of 20 dice. You'll then shake them up. You'll pull one out blindly. And if it's blue, I get to activate. If it's green, you get to activate. And then you do your activation. And then you just keep pulling until there are no more dice in the bag. So that's how order dice work if there are people out there who have not played bolt action, just to give you an idea. Like I said, I like it. I think it's kind of neat. I like the concept of there's some randomness. There's some swinginess. It's not just a static I go, you go, or alternating activation, which I also like. Like, I like both. I like the randomness of the order dice, but I like the structure of the, like, we just alternate activations and that's it. I don't think either one is any better than the other. I would say that the standard alternating activations is a bit more interactive. Excuse me. You do have the ability to set things in ambush. So you have an ambush order or Overwatch. I forget what the actual order's called. And again, we'll kind of cover that in a little bit. But you can be like, well, I have to activate a unit, but I don't really want to activate this unit yet. But I know I want to react to something you're doing. Well, I'm going to put it in ambush. And then when you do a thing, I have the potential to try to interact with you on your activation. It's not a guarantee. It's just a potential. So there's also that. Which, again, I like. I like that it's not just a, I am guaranteed to do this thing that I want to do, even though it's your activation. Wizards have rules for casting and dispelling, which, again, I like. And I don't mean to knock 40k, but I don't like the way they've gone with 10th edition, where wizard casting is no longer really a thing. They're just baked in attacks and abilities on the datasheet. Again, it's less interactive, and that game is already fairly low, in my opinion, on the interactivity. So with the game already not being really interactive, taking something that was actually kind of interactive and then stripping it away and reducing the interaction between the two players, I just feel like that was not a good move. So with wizards having, like, I roll dice to cast spells, you roll dice to dispel spells, I like it. I like it a lot. There isn't like an automatically I do this, again, unless you just don't have a wizard. So generally, games flow well between players. The rules promote a lot of back and forth and a lot of conversation and gameplay. And again, this is one of the things I like about more interactive games, is that it actively feels like I'm playing a game. You and I are playing a game together rather than I'm playing my game, you're playing your game. I haven't really come across much, if any at all, of just like a pick it up. I'm sure there's something in there that could do it. I haven't played a lot of games, and I haven't really dove into the monsters yet. So a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you is based off of my experience with like knights, infantry, wizards, stuff like that, but nothing like big dragons and stuff. And even in the game, they tell you like, hey, before you start using dragons and monsters, make sure your opponent has a dragon or monster. Like don't just be like, I get to take it. You know, they can be powerful, so at least make sure your opponent has something that can work with it or around it. You know, and there's no, again, that I've seen, there's no real like mortal wounds or anything that's going to just shut off your ability to interact, which to me is just a net positive. So for interactivity, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. I think, like I said, like a truly alternating activation game, like a Halo Flashpoint or a Firefight, would probably get a 5. In fact, I'd have to double check, but I think for Halo, I did give it a 5 on interactivity. There's a lot of good back and forth there. But with the order dice and the ambushing and just the fact that players can continuously interact with each other, 4 out of 5. Really solid. Investment. And remember, this refers to money and time. And I will say up front, this game does not require a significant time investment to learn. Despite some kind of clunky mechanics on the front end, once you get a few games under the belt, they flow well, and they make sense. It is made to be played with any existing fantasy minis, so if you already have minis, your investment is even lower, because now you can blow the dust off of some of those and breathe new life into them. They are fairly generic with the intent of you bringing your old Warhammer fantasy, although now there's Old World, but you get what I'm saying. You know, these old, even like some of your old D&D minis, if you have some of those, would make excellent characters and stuff. So the game is designed for you to use whatever minis you have available that can kind of just fit whatever's in there, which is awesome. So there's no additional financial investment if you already have armies from games like Kings of War and Old World. The only issue you're going to run into with Kings of War is that if you've got the scenic bases, because Kings of War you don't remove casualties, then you're really not going to be able to use them, because this isn't a rank and file game. This is a tight coherency game. And what I mean by that is Old World, rank and file, you move in squares. Kings of War, rank and file, you move in squares. AOS, tight coherency, 1-inch coherency. Everything has to be within 1 inch of at least one other model. This game, same mechanic. So rather than having facings and stuff, it uses 1-inch coherency to tighten everybody up, and then you still get to move and shoot in whatever direction. But there's, you know, rules for line of sight through your own models and stuff like that. So that's all kind of accounted for. It has received at least one update since its initial release. The reason this is important for investment is if you buy it, you know it's been updated. And if it's been updated once, there's a good chance it'll get updated again. And that's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but at least it lets you know that the company is maintaining it to some degree. I don't know when I got the message, but I was recently sent a message about updates. I bought the book about 5 years ago. I never really got a chance to dig into it and play it. And I was searching through my emails for something, came across a message, didn't check the date on it, just saw that there was an update, went and downloaded the update. Couldn't even tell you what's different, to be honest with you, because I never really got to play before the update. USRs and hit mod tables can slow the game down. And that's just because while you're playing and learning, you're going to have to look a bunch of stuff up. Well, I'm going to make my ranged attacks. Well, do I have this? Did you do that? Did I have this? Did you do that? Etc., etc. So when you first start playing, there's going to be a lot of like looking stuff up. Thankfully, again, the game is in Battlescribe, so if you make your list in Battlescribe, it's going to have all the USRs for your units, and then whoever did that made sure that they defined all the USRs at the bottom of the unit page. So if you use Battlescribe, you add the unit, you click the 3 dots, you hit the eyeball, whatever it is, or view, and then it'll give you your unit. It'll tell you their special rules, and then down at the bottom, it'll tell you what they do. So that can save time if you use Battlescribe for looking up your USRs. But just know your upfront time, your time to learn the game is going to be a little bit slower because of USRs. Some of the mods The modifiers, what I mean by that, are forced rerolls, and others are hit roll modifiers. And this is just more to keep track of. And I don't dislike it. I actually like it a lot. What I mean by that is, so if you run, right, you're -1 to hit, for example. But if you sprint, which is a special run order that allows you to go even further, but then you might get like a pin token. Instead of -1 to hit, your opponent now has to reroll all their hit rolls into you, their successful hit rolls. So it's one of those, like, I'm not opposed to it. I actually think that's kind of a cool mechanic, and it stacks with everything else. So if you're like -1 to hit, and you need 4s to hit me, and this is a lower the better game on the die. So like 1, 2, 3, 4 would hit on a 4, like hitting on 4s would be 4 and lower. So if you need 4s to hit, you got like a 40% chance to hit me, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep. 40% chance to hit. But now you're having to re-roll any successful hits you've got. Like, that's a big jump in efficiency. Like, that's a big decrease. So I like the mechanic. It's just, again, on the front end, it's more to kind of keep track of. But again, once you play it a few times, it all sticks and makes sense. So for investment, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. It doesn't require a lot of time, but expect to have to play probably 2 to 3 games of it before some of the stuff kind of starts gelling and making sense. And that's, to me, that's almost an expectation for games like this. Rarely are you going to pick up a game like this and then the first time you play it, you're like, oh, this all makes sense. Generally speaking, it takes 2 to 3 games, so I think this is like right with what I would consider average for learning a game in this type of game. Fit and finish. So I'm going to be upfront with you. I have the PDF. I don't have much to say about it. I'm just going to give it a 3 out of 5 for an average score because I don't have shit to say about it. I don't have any of the Warlord models. I imagine that they're just fine because I used to have some bolt action stuff, and I know they have fantasy models. I don't have any of them. But I'm just going to give it an average rating. Basically, I have no opinion, and the easiest way for me to say I have no opinion is 3 out of 5. So let's talk about what it does well. What does Warlords of Erehwon do well? Well, first of all, I find the order dice to be an interesting mechanic, and they play well. They play fine. Now, I know I said that there will be occasions where they don't. But overall, it's a good mechanic. It handles activations very well. It's not, to me, what would be peak activations, but it's a good system. It works, and it keeps the gameplay kind of more interesting when it's a bit more dynamic. Orders in place of actions is both good and bad because it is fewer mechanics to try to learn because you're not learning how to stack actions and do all these things. Instead of actions, you get orders, and then the orders specifically tell you what you do. So instead of, like, again, to bring up Firefight, when you activate, you're allowed to take 2 short actions or 1 long action, and then you have a list of all these actions, and then you're like, well, if I move, I can't move again, but I can do this other short action. So it's just stacking actions. And if you've played Necromunda or anything like that, it's going to be a very familiar system. Even like Shadowrun or Dungeons and Dragons, it's almost the same concept. With Warlords, it's literally, I activate, I have 6 options. This is what I can do with those 6 options. And most of the time, I just cannot deviate from those 6 options. There are some, exceptions, like wizards, because they get to cast in addition to their orders, so there's some exceptions there, but for the most part, it's just like everybody has 6 orders. This is what everybody gets to do. This is how the game works. So it's a little easier to learn because you have fewer mechanics and gives you good depth of play. The only downside to the order system is that it can be a little restrictive sometimes, but again, it's done well, and it's done in a way that makes the game work. Gameplay, super smooth once the orders and order dice are understood. I would recommend a cheat sheet for when you get started. Sorry about that weird cut there. I thought I had heard somebody knocking at the bedroom door, which was super weird. It turns out it was just my dog scratching and then banging her big dumper into the door. So, where were we? Orders in place of actions, fewer mechanics. Gameplay is smooth once orders and order dice are understood. Again, I recommend a cheat sheet for modifiers and for orders when you get started. It will make the game smoother and faster instead of having to constantly flip through the book or PDF, whatever you have. Just get them printed. They do have tables, so you can print them out easily. The problem is that the tables are kind of buried in the book, which we'll get into because that's one of my gripes. The generic rules for the armies mean that games are typically balanced, which is cool. You never go into a game going, well, you won because you had orcs, or you won because you had dwarves, or I lost because I had elves, or I lost because I had humans. Generally speaking, the games are balanced because there's not a lot of flavor, which coincidentally we're going to come back to in a little bit here. I'm sure there's some sort of lore, background, fluff for the game, but it seems to take a back seat. There's like little snippets throughout the rule book. That's not why I play games. I play games for the dice rolling and the social aspect of it. And so, to me, the fact that I'm not having whatever their backstory is crammed down my throat is a benefit. It may not be to you. What I like about it is that it makes it easier for like my daughter and I to sit and make our own scenarios, to sit and make our own stories. Their undead army is predicated around necromancers and zombies, but all she has are Nighthaunt. Well, that's fine. We can use chain rasps as zombies, but now she can just tell her own ghost story because she's not feeling confined. And not that you should ever feel confined, but man, some games, they just like cram that right down your throat. And so the fact that that's not the case here is a very liberating feeling to be like, well, this is my captain, this is his name, we're going to make our own little campaign and story. We don't have to worry about like, well, what about what happened over here, stuff like that. And again, some people want that. They want that predefined universe to set their games in. I don't. I would much rather have something where I can just take it and be like, okay, we're going to make it mine now. And the game is designed to be flexible. You don't have the right model, who cares? As long as it's kind of close and you and your opponent can agree. And a good example of that is like my daughter doesn't have a lich on the undead chariot. And she really doesn't have any chariots. But what she does have is she has a Lady Olander model. And it's large and could reasonably fill the role of her Warlord Lich with a chariot, so it works, It's a great, great way to just be like, well, my Warlord's actually just Lady Olander, but she's going to be a chariot today. And the game is very kind of like geared towards that. Like, hey, you know what? What do you have? Does it reasonably fit into this? Awesome. Let's do it. Let's make it work. So... what else does it do? Well, I do want to shout out the terrain rules. I'm not going to dig very deep into them. Just know that they're fairly simple, but still very impactful. This game has done a good job of saying, okay, well, like, here's what woods should do. Here's what barricades should do. Here's how they should impact the game. And that's awesome. And it's a good balance between, like, literal and abstract. The problem I have with some games is they're either too abstract, or they're too literal. And this game does find a good balance between the two. What could it improve upon? Well, pins they can feel really obtuse sometimes. And I know it's a big part of how this game and even how bolt action work. But tracking pins on separate units and how often units get pins and tracking when you reduce pins, it can be a bit much sometimes. Most of the time it's not bad. But there are definitely rare occasions where it feels like I'm just playing Pin Markers, the game, rather than Warlords of Erehwon. So it's one of those, like, it's an interesting mechanic. It has its upsides. And most of the time it doesn't feel intrusive, but you do get some games where you're just like, sure, like let's just buckets of pins everywhere. The rules are generic enough that armies do feel kind of samey. So even though being generic was one of its strengths, it's also something that could improve upon. There isn't a ton to differentiate between like orcs and humans. So if you wanted to use this game to kind of set up like a Warcraft kind of like scenario, right? You could have literally you could use this game to recreate the original Warcraft 1, which I think was just called Warcraft Orcs and Humans on PC. That's how old I am. But you could kind of like recreate that campaign with this game, which is super dope. But there isn't a ton to differentiate between the two. There is a little bit in like the stat lines and stuff, but it's not a lot. And really what I think would benefit this game a lot is some sort of generic kind of order system, kind of like Firefight, or even, I don't want to say stratagems like Warhammer, because that, I don't want them to interact the way they do in Warhammer, but just the same concept. You know, like older AOS, how you could give commands. You know, and you had to be within range of a command unit. Like that type of interaction. Keep it small, keep it limited, maybe like 5 to 6 orders per army. Just enough to give them something where you can be like, well, this is what makes my army feel like my army. That's what I would say. And really, like, my daughter and I have started to implement one as we've kind of played the game and worked on our progress. And I will put a progress link in the description. I'll probably just post a link to the Google Doc and then just let everybody be a commenter. You will not be editors. I don't need that in my life. But I'll add you as commenters so that if you have ideas, you can feel free to drop them. And then, you know, these orders have allowed for the armies to get a little bit of flavor without breaking the game. Generally speaking, I've designed them to just kind of like small buffs that make sense for how the army works. And a good example would be she's got undead. I have an order where, like, I'm trying to remember exactly how I did it, but it's basically doesn't matter. I guess my brain didn't want to work. But anyway, there'll be a link. You can read them. So, and this may sound like a nitpick, but the book needs an appendix. It needs an appendix with the modifiers and the USRs. If you are going to use USRs and a boatload of modifiers, you need to just copy and paste those tables into 1 or 2 pages in the back of the book so that they're all together and easy to find. It pisses me off when companies are like, well, here's 6 hit roll modifiers for shooting, and now there's also like 2 or 3 hit re-rolls for shooting, and here's 17 pages of universal, well, not 17, but like they literally have a table that takes up 1 page, and they're like, here's our universal special rules, all in 1 table with a brief description of what they do. Bro, why can't you put that in the back of the damn book so I can find it? Why do you bury it in the book? Like, that's just a complaint that I have when companies do that. It's kind of like when they don't make an appendix. Like, oh God, it just chaps my ass. If you're making a rule book, you should have either an appendix or an index, especially when you're using stuff like USRs. Final verdict, it's a well-written and very well-structured game that uses a very familiar skeleton to anybody who's played bolt action. Gameplay is pretty smooth and fast after a couple games, but it doesn't ever feel shallow or boring. The army list could use a bit more flavor and maybe more structure, like a force organization chart. But it never really, the game never really sets out to be something that it isn't. It's very much designed to give you a good functional rule set for your fantasy minis that is interactive and entertaining. And overall, I'd give it a 4 out of 5. I think it's a great game. I think more people should take a look at it. I think it's worth the time if you learn how to play it. And I think it's very much worth building a community around, especially if you have somebody who's willing to do the work of like building out worlds and campaigns and stuff like that. So again, overall, 4 out of 5. Great game. Do recommend. And that's going to wrap us up. Thanks for watching. Big shout out to Lord Wellingstone and Danny Boy, my patrons. I wanted to shout you guys out. I forgot to put the slide on here, but I'm at least going to give you the auditory shout out. Appreciate you. And again, if you do want to support the channel, all the Patreon, merch store, all that, all the links are in the description. Thanks a lot. Have a good day. And up on the screen, you're going to be seeing a link to my Firefight series. And, you know, if you've never played Firefight, check that out. Thanks.